It's nice to be somewhere physical in the real world, as well as being online. So thank you, Sophia and Matt, for inviting me. I'm going to talk for probably about 40 to 45 minutes. And really, the whole talk is based on kind of two things I want to persuade you of. The first is that playgrounds are really interesting places for thinking about architecture. Partly, I think that's because they're a kind of challenge to architects, to landscape architects, to interior designers and interior architects. And that's for quite explicit reasons. Very rarely are playgrounds designed in consultation with the actual users and clients. Okay, the few times that they are have quite kind of conventional outcomes. You know, the children, when asked to devise their own playground, will have something quite conventional in mind based on the playgrounds that they've already used. So that kind of relationship with the client, the user, puts kind of playgrounds into a relationship, I think, with prisons, schools, and hospitals to some degree, even though they're probably their ethos that they'd want would be the opposite of that. The second thing that I want to suggest to you is that playgrounds are very useful for thinking about what we might mean by social architecture. And this isn't just about how architecture responds to society's needs. It's to think about, if we see playgrounds as some form of social architecture, I want to argue, we need to think about energy, we need to think about mood, atmosphere, a whole range of kind of intangible things, but also something that I want to call cultural infrastructure. And by cultural infrastructure, I mean all the things that allow a cultural form, an architectural form like the playground to exist, which might be things as material as, you know, the manufacturers of slides and swings, but also the advice literature, the insurance policies, all these sorts of things around playgrounds. Okay, what I'm going to do in the main talk, my main example is going to be not these playgrounds. These playgrounds were photographed by an artist, Austrian artist called Peter Friedel, who took photographs from all around the world. The playgrounds here are Japan, Johannesburg, France, and Germany, I think. But he produced this book called Playgrounds, and the homogeneity of playgrounds from all around the world is quite kind of startling. You know, this was kind of done between 2006 and 2011. So we could say that this idea of the conventional playground as a kind of unsupervised space for children to play has become a kind of global form, recognizable kind of everywhere. What I'm going to talk about, my main examples are going to be these playgrounds that were called variously junk playgrounds, spare material playgrounds, and we probably know them best as adventure playgrounds. But at this point, this is from the 1950s, early 60s. This is Notting Hill Playground. They weren't as they are now. So if you know adventure playgrounds, for instance, the St. Paul's Adventure Playground or the Windmill Hill City Farm Adventure Playground, this is not what I'm talking about. These are kind of much earlier versions, and I'll see, I'll show you how they differed from what we have now, which is probably more correctly called an adventure playground style playground. Okay, I'm going to start by reading you an allegory around architecture and the playground. This is from a book called Adventure Playgrounds, by Jack Lambert. It's from the 70s. And he's a playground leader. And there's lots and lots of literature by playground leaders about what playgrounds should be like, how they should be. Okay, this is how he begins. Once upon a time, a new and very modern housing estate was being built. The architects, on their frequent visits to the site, noticed that the children were always playing with the materials being used to build the houses. The contractors were soon ahead of schedule, that's quite rare, and the town council were told that the project would cost less than was at first estimated. I imagine that's rarer still. Everyone was very pleased, and it was decided to use the extra money to build a playground for the children. The architects who had planned the housing estate had a meeting to discuss how the playground should be designed. But alas, they could not reach a conclusion which was satisfactory to all. Everyone was very unhappy until someone said, why not ask the children what they want? And so they asked the children. But the children had so many different ideas, more even than the architects themselves, that once again, no conclusion could be reached. Eventually, it was agreed that the children should be given planks of wood and bricks and cement, and all the tools they needed to build a new playground themselves. And when the playground had been built by the children, the architects would see what they really wanted, and then they could build it properly. So the children were given planks of wood and bricks and cement, and all the tools they needed to build a new playground. And the architects sat down and watched and waited, and waited, and waited. After 25 years, the playground has still not been finished by the children, but the architects are still waiting, in case one day it will be finished, and at last they will know what children really want. So the idea of an adventure playground or a junk playground is a kind of radical invitation to architecture of a space of the unmade, of unmaking, of unbuilding, of building then destroying, of kind of radical forms of making shanty towns, all sorts of things. So this is, I think, what one of the things that I think is a kind of interesting thing to look at from a kind of architectural perspective, a kind of a space of radical unmaking, a different kind of space than a kind of design space. Okay, now to get here, to try and explain how these spatial forms came about, how these playgrounds emerged, I need to take you back a bit. And I'm going to go back to the end of the 19th century. This is when playgrounds kind of take on their modern form. Kids have been swinging on rope, sliding down things, doing all sorts of things for forever. But in the end of the 19th century, you get a specific form that you could point to and say, that is a playground. The picture with all the little children in the box, that's called a sand garden. And they first emerge in Berlin about a year before they come to America. And what you get, and this happens a lot in kind of playground culture, you get something kind of emerging in one place, often kind of Europe, and then getting picked up in kind of various other places. So these are these sandboxes, and they were called sand gardens for obvious kind of reasons, because they were growing children. This was a kind of nurturing space, very much related to the kindergarten movement, where that child garden, the idea of the child garden with the child gardener, the kindergartner, looking after these kind of wee things. So Boston and Chicago become places where this kind of really dynamic kind of playground movement emerges. And it kind of sets up a number of things that become quite particular for playgrounds. in the first half of the 20th century, certainly in the early decades, in the 1910s and 1920s. One is these kind of climbing frames. And so, you know, one of the best ways, I think, of thinking about one aspect of the early playgrounds is that they're really just outdoor gymnasiums. People have taken the idea of the gymnasium from a school, from an athletic club, and said, why don't we do this outside? So you get these kind of huge kind of frameworks for outdoor kind of gymnasium things. So these are the things that kind of get sold. The manufacturers start making. They've been making playground equipment for schools, and now they're saying, okay, well, now you can have these for your playgrounds. They're mainly calisthenic. You know, they're to do with kind of making you fit. They're not necessarily about having fun. A lot of them about kind of climbing up poles, but of course, you know, there's kind of fun to be had in that too. So a lot of the elements are kind of trapeze elements, climbing, rope climbing, and kind of various things like that. There are also things that we could consider more to do with exhilaration. This is the giant leap. And the giant leap was a very kind of standard piece of playground equipment, probably up until the 60s and 1960s and 70s. You kind of, it's like a maypole. You kind of run round with these chains, and then you just jump in the air, and the momentum and the kind of centrifugal force, you know, propels you, makes you kind of fly around for a while. So the elements that made up a playground in the first decades of the 20th century, across most of Europe, Scandinavia, North America, I haven't been able to find out that much information apart from through American sources about the rest of the world. But the elements that were in place that were kind of crucial were that there was a building. You wouldn't have a playground without a building. And these playgrounds were huge. They were often for about 1,000 children at a time, for 1,000 children a day. So there would be a building, and that building would often have a library. And if it didn't have a library, then it would have a relationship with the library, and books would be brought in and brought out. So when we use the word playground, kind of historically, it was often about a whole range of other things apart from slides and swings. In fact, slides and swings were very, very kind of minimal within that idea. Much more important were things like dancing, folk dancing. So, you know, a crucial bit of playground equipment was a record player. So there would be dancing, reading, games, organized games, and various things like that. And this movement, the kind of playground movement, came out of kind of various elements, partly a kind of form of what gets called muscular Christianity. This is a kind of idea of, you know, this is what children need. But the muscular Christianity was very much set up against a certain idea of capitalism that was coming along. So it was a kind of recognition in America that they were kind of training kids to be kind of aggressively egotistical for the capitalist market. But here in these kind of playgrounds, there would be there'd be something else that you could offer, and that would be a sense of loyalty to the collective. Forms of games, especially kind of team games, where your ego was reduced significantly because you wanted the team to win. It wasn't all about you. But probably the most crucial thing around the playground movement was the idea that it was going to stop boys, and this is the gendering of playgrounds is crucial. A lot of the kind of the things that we're looking at you know, the equipment, for instance, you'd have to buy two of, because you'd buy one for the boys, one for the girls. There would kind of be, there'd be a kind of gender split with the kind of use of equipment. But one of the things I want to suggest to you is that boys become very much at the heart of the kind of playground movement. Partly because one of the things that the playgrounds are set up to do is to stop juvenile delinquency. And this is I think, a crucial element here. You even get things like in some of the early playground literature, like a judge saying, I was talking to this man, he was on death row, he was a murderer, and I was trying to find out why he became a murderer. And he told me that when he was a child, when he went to play, he'd go and play down by the railway tracks. And there's a kind of logic there that because he didn't have a playground, he became a murderer. And this is what will happen. If you don't have playgrounds, you'll become a deviant, a delinquent. And there is a kind of straightforward kind of argument being made here in a lot of kind of municipal meetings saying you're going to save money by having, even though a playground might be expensive, you're going to save money because you're going to save people from being run over by traffic, and you're going to save people from murdering each other and going to prison and being expensive for the municipality because of that. Okay, so I mean, it's mainly playgrounds are kind of set up mainly for the idea of the juvenile delinquent boy, and a lot of the figures around kind of playground use that I've been able to find is that a lot of these kind of playgrounds, the proportion of boys to girls is massively in favour of the numbers being for boys. I think there are a number of reasons for that, to do with kind of leisure time and how much leisure time different people have. But I'll talk more about that as we kind of go through. There are things around the idea of the fallen girl, the fallen woman, who will be led astray if she plays in the street. And the street will be somewhere where the kind of temptations for lasciviousness, for all sorts of kind of moral wrongdoing is kind of possibility. Okay, so that's kind of one version of the playground. And I think a number of things happened between that time and the Second World War, which is to do with kind of financial collapse, with the Great Depression. What happens is that a certain kind of idea of the playground gets reduced to these kind of calisthenic and fun devices, you know, swings, slides, seesaws, sandpits, the 4 S's, and a roundabout if you're lucky, and then kind of climbing frames. And the expense of having supervision, someone to look after these playgrounds, gets pushed aside, and so does the idea of having a building, having a kind of interior space. Now it kind of reappears in the 30s and 40s, and one of the places it reappears is in Denmark. There's a landscape architect called Carl Theodor Sorensen, who gets thought of as like the person who kind of invents the idea of the junk playground. He thinks about it, he's kind of planning lots of parks in Denmark, but it's really in by the 40s that he decides to have a kind of junk playground, and it gets very much associated with social housing projects. So there's a kind of big housing project for the working class on the edge of Copenhagen, and he thinks, okay, well, this is where I'll set up a playground where children can play by building, by being builders, by making houses for themselves. So this is Emdrup,
That's the name of the playground. And it gets visited by loads and loads of people. I mean, as a kind of sidebar, this is happening in Denmark during the war, while the Danish were, you know, while the Nazis were in charge of Denmark, which I think kind of makes those kind of towers, those kind of lookout towers, have a kind of different kind of resonance for me. So one of the people that goes and visits Endrup is this woman, Lady Allen of Hertwood. And she becomes a kind of very kind of international, important person around kind of playgrounds. She's a campaigner. She'd during the war, she'd kind of really effectively campaigned to change how children's homes were run in this country. You know, did a kind of amazing job. Her real, she was Marjorie Gill. Her husband was Clifford Allen, a socialist politician who was very ill and who, to become an effective, you know, someone effective in Parliament, became knighted so that he could go into the House of Lords. Hence, she's Lady Allen of Hertwood, or Marjorie Gill. So she sets up this idea. So in 1946, loads of children are playing in bomb sites. London is filled with bomb sites. What a great place to play. What a great place to break your leg as well. And what a great place for all sorts of, you get kind of loads of stories around this time about playgrounds, and you get loads of films as well. Hue and Cry is a kind of notable film around the playgrounds of these kind of places as spaces where all sorts of people might hang out. You know, very kind of difficult people, prostitutes, spivs, all sorts. So it's kind of morally corrupting kind of place. Anyway, so Lady Allen of Hertwood suggests, why not use these bomb sites and have them as playgrounds? They're not being used. Most of them are not going to be kind of built on for another 10 years or so. So in the meantime, why not give them to the kids? And kind of very kind of radical projects came around saying, actually, why not give these spaces to the children properly so that they could use them and make money from them and own them and all sorts of things? That never quite flies. But what does happen is places get set up and they become places for children to play as if they were on the kind of bomb sites. They were bomb sites. So this particular playground is called Lollard Adventure Playground. And it's important not because it was the first, it wasn't, not because it was a long lasting, it only lasted 5 years, but it was kind of established by Lady Allen of Hertwood to have various kind of precedents in mind that would then be kind of rolled out. This is where the kind of cultural infrastructure of playgrounds kind of really begins. They come up with things like the playground leader. It's not a role for an amateur. This is someone who should be paid the same wages that a teacher, a professional teacher, should be paid. So there's kind of idea of kind of professionalizing that role. There are ideas about how you kind of ran the playground. The beginning of discussion about what it meant to be a playground leader. And this kind of emerges as someone who, very much unlike the playground movement in the early part of the century, this was someone who was meant not to say no. So if, you know, a child wanted to build a rocket, you would say, oh, right, okay, well, how should we go about that? How can I help you? The only times you were to say no was if one child's fun was ruining the fun of another child. You know, that was the ethos. So there's also a lot of interest in the kind of political possibilities of the playground. Anarchists were getting really involved in this, thinking, wow, this is a different conception of society. This is a kind of democratic
world where everyone takes responsibility for themselves, where people learn from experience. They don't say, oh, you can't build a fire because you might burn yourself. They say, build a fire, see what happens. And children will learn from experience. One of the playground books, adventure playground books that are kind of celebrating what an adventure playground can do, actually begins with 3 photographs of a 6-year-old hammering in a nail. And it's got 3 photographs, and the 3rd photograph is he's hit his hand and he's crying his eyes out. So this is this is how you're going to be sold adventure playgrounds. It was about experience, it was about learning, it was about risk, all those things that we kind of pulled back from and become averse to. So these became Lollard Street in particular. It's in Lambeth. You can, well, if you're in this, there's an adventure playground there now, but it's nothing to do with this place. This place is now a school. They built a school on top of it. It was originally a school, got bombed. 5 years later, it became a school again. You can see the Houses of Parliament from here. So this was a very strategic place. They were going to say, right, okay, we'll get the politicians. They'll come and see the possibilities of what a playground can be, of how our kids can use this space, not just for building or doing this or that, but as a way of producing new kinds of subjects, new kind of people. This is partly what I mean by social architecture. This idea that space, architectural space, built and unbuilt space, produces subjects. And these were going to be subjects who would be autonomous, would be in control of themselves, would be able to, this was like a kind of a big thing, would be able to have a kind of democratic ethos that would be able to resist the lure of fascism. Okay, this was kind of like an important element. So the Lollard Street Adventure Playground lasted for about 5 years. Well, the lease was for 5 years from the council, and a lot of kind of literature was produced at the time. So Lady Allen of Hertwood kind of recognised that actually you don't want to write books, you want to kind of make leaflets and brochures. That was the way to go. People could buy them very cheaply. They could be disseminated very easily. So it's material like this is kind of being produced around Lollard Street. This is an account of the playground. It's also got information about how you might set up your own playground. And there's also various things about how they went wrong. Failure is a big part of these playgrounds. A lot of it is about, a lot of the literature is how how as a playground worker I hit kids, and then I realized that wasn't the right thing to do. That wasn't working out too well for me. How we had this kind of playground and this gang took over and smashed everyone's dens. That happens a lot. The smashing up by gangs of other people's dens is a big part of this. Okay, so there were kind of elements of this that a lot of people can be kind of very celebratory around adventure playgrounds, and I think there's a lot to celebrate around them. I think part of this is that they do seem to have an incredibly kind of inclusive role within communities, within societies. The gendering aspect of it is, seems kind of insistent, kind of endless. I mean, all the pictures you see, all the boys doing the kind of physical things, and the girls kind of sitting around. And it's not just that these were the roles that they adopted, although they were the roles that they adopted. This was actually kind of built into some of the playgrounds. So you get, for instance, activities going on in the big huts where only boys are allowed in, bicycle mending, carpentry, kind of things like that. Okay, so I want to suggest 3 kind of critical things that I think are kind of interesting more generally about kind of playgrounds and might be interesting for you as architects or as designers or interior architects. And that the first one of these is mediation. There is no playground. Playgrounds are mediated in all sorts of ways. You know, these places are gone. We know them through photography. We know them through books that have been written about them. And we need to kind of take that kind of seriously. We need to kind of think about that kind of in a big way. One of the things that I'm finding is that, you know, there is masses and masses of photographs of children playing, but they're always doing this kind of play. And if we think about play as having a, you know, kind of huge range from daydreaming to jumping off buildings, then you've got to look at these photographs and say, actually, they've just really concentrated on one physical aspect of play. You know, it's this image of the daring do's of children. That has a kind of huge kind of knock-on effect when you're thinking about what happens in playgrounds. And this is, I think, where the kind of gendering of playgrounds is, you know, you really need to think about this in relation to the forms of mediation. So what gets recorded is often kind of masculine play. People physically kind of moving cars around, building, doing stuff like that. What you don't see are some of the activities. For instance, there was Lollard Adventure Playground. One of the things that they did was they had a magazine club and they produced a magazine. We never see photographs of that being done. And a lot of that work is being done by the girls at the playground. There's also the sense of kind of literature. I mean, one of the kind of critiques at the moment coming out is that adventure playgrounds are kind of really are focused on the kind of heroic man as the kind of playground leader, who leads by having a kind of masculine prowess, being, you know, really good at kind of building and physical stuff. It's not necessarily true. But it's certainly true that the people who write the accounts of playground leaders are men. So one of the aspects of my project is trying to recover the voices of the women who were playground leaders who didn't get to write their accounts, or who didn't write their accounts. So mediation is kind of really crucial, I think, to thinking about how we know about playgrounds and kind of what playgrounds are. Another element that I've kind of alluded to is the idea of there being kind of a whole range of taxonomies of play. Play doesn't exist simply as, you know, kind of running around and jumping. Roger Calwa, a surrealist philosopher, in the 1960s, wrote a book on play, and what he does is kind of establishes 4 different kinds of play. Basically, there's kind of rule-based play, competitive-based play, mimicry, and kind of danger play, which he calls Illinics. And even within those 4 taxonomies of play, there are kind of tendencies of kind of studious form of them, and a kind of really kind of exuberant kind of element of it. And it does strike me that one of the kind of elements around kind of playgrounds and kind of play that we get is a real stress on the idea of kind of vertiginous play, of that kind of play. Well, hey, let's jump off this kind of play, and less concentration on the idea of play as something quite kind of studious, quite kind of concentrated.
one of the ways that they sold adventure playgrounds was to say, don't worry about adventure playgrounds. They're not like the playgrounds with slides and swings where all the kids are screaming their head off the whole time. These are playgrounds where actually it's really quiet because people are so concentrated on their activities, much more like the kind of play that you get with a child kind of digging in the sand and kind of doing stuff like that. The third and final aspect that I want to suggest is that playgrounds are haunted by the social issues that they're trying to address. So some of this comes up, I think, in kind of interesting ways. The idea so you get this kind of incredible kind of fear, of course. I mean, proportionally, in the 50s and 60s, more children were being killed in car accidents by about 100 times than is the case today. There's probably a lot more traffic accidents, but the amount per population and per amount of cars has absolutely kind of dwindled to non-existent. So you're getting kind of roads where 5 children would be kind of knocked down in a week. So traffic is seen as a kind of huge element to this, and you actually get these kind of traffic playgrounds being kind of set up in all sorts of in Switzerland, Germany, in the UK, to kind of teach people about kind of traffic. And one of the forms that I'm kind of particularly interested in is the idea of a playground as an enclosed space, as somewhere to segregate children away from the rest of the city. Like the city is a place that's inhospitable to children. So right, let's make these kind of gulags, these kind of places, these kind of quarantine spaces where children can go and do their weird stuff on their own and not get in the way of the running of a proper city. And kind of part of this, I think, is this idea of the juvenile delinquent as someone who kind of haunts this space, that almost these spaces have to be kind of segregated kind of spaces. These are kind of this conversation you get with police at this time, saying, oh, it's great that John is going to the adventure playground. If he was doing the stuff like he's doing at the adventure playground down the road, he'd be in prison. So there's an idea that play is criminalized in the city. So you get these, so the whole idea of a playground is the recognition of that criminalization of children and play within the city. And the idea that these are kind of quarantine places for that to be allowable. Now, I think one of the elements of that is it doesn't solve any problem. It just that problem is then haunted in these playgrounds, and it becomes even more association with criminality of children's play within the city. If you've got playgrounds and you still insist on doing your kind of jumping and running and climbing and stuff outside the playground, then you really are kind of asking for trouble. That would be a kind of logics of this. So that makes me think, okay, well, really you need to think about what's the problem that a playground is designed to address. And this is where I want to kind of just give you a final example. This is an architect called Aldo van Eyck, who was associated with the group Team 10. Team 10 is a kind of critical international architectural group that is a kind of critique of Le Corbusier and the idea of kind of rational planning. Aldo van Eyck builds over 700 playgrounds in Amsterdam between 1948 and 1972. These are kind of different kinds of playgrounds than the adventure playgrounds, but they're also different kind of playgrounds from the swings and slides. And they're different partly because of the huge number of them. They're everywhere.
You know, it's over 700 is a kind of big number for one city, and their doorstep. He calls them doorstep playgrounds because they're everywhere. And there's no separation between the playground and the city. There's no kind of fenced off area. There's no idea here of a kind of quarantine space. And that's because the issue that Aldo van Eyck was addressing wasn't what do we do with problem kids? What do we do with kind of kids playing? His issue was what do we do with a city that has refused children? That is inhospitable to children's play, and how can we remake that city so it becomes a place that's kind of rewilded with kind of children's play? And I think that's the kind of issue that I'm kind of thinking about at the moment is, you know, how might urban space be rewilded through an incorporation of children's play? This might mean a whole range of different ways of thinking about children's play and about space. It might mean using the kind of tactics of the adventure playground movement, where there were these kind of bombed spaces that were only going to be available for 5, maybe 10 years, using them. I mean, urban space is constantly changing. But it also might be around these Aldo van Eyck idea of a kind of doorstep playground that isn't a kind of quarantine space, but just very much part of the kind of urban fabric. Okay, that's me done.